When people talk about or discuss Linux as a subject, more often than not, the most common kind of connotation one can draw is that of it being free, both in terms of beer money free, but also free in terms of access. Anyone can download the Linux kernel and many of the distros built upon it, and do as they wish with them. As the Linux kernel is under the general public license, any direct modifications to the kernel or certain types of drivers, modules, usually have to be open source, though userland applications, userland referring to programs and software that the user interacts with, Steam, Discord, etc., can remain proprietary. However, there are a few cases where, whilst the distro itself may be open source, it may not be as simple to get your hands on a copy as you'd think. More often than not, the Linux distros that are not very welcoming to a consumer level user base are those distros actively managed, developed and owned by corporations and businesses. Now, this can be an affront to parts of the Linux ethos of free access and openness. Some of these privately developed or privately owned Linux distros can come bundled with accompanying software that may not only entail a large price tag at first look, but also may be in the form of pre-compiled binaries. Red Hat is a good example of this. They even opt to exclusively market themselves to big corpo, with their average Joe consumer level distro having been discontinued in 2003. Now, Red Hat does a few things. Firstly, it is a software company that provides different kinds of software to its clients, which include its flagship product, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which you might have guessed from the name, primarily serves businesses and organizations. Red Hat did used to develop and maintain a consumer-grade Linux distro called Red Hat Linux, but as I mentioned, that was discontinued in 2003 after the company went through a little bit of a self-discovery phase and realized how much cha-ching they could make in selling their products bundled with support and certifications in a subscription-based model to businesses, which they couldn't justify to do with their consumer-level distro, so they just discontinued development and now opt to be a partner with Fedora, which is the spiritual successor to the original Red Hat Linux. Fedora is community developed, and this partnership also saves Red Hat themselves from getting their hands dirty with developing two separate distros serving two separate markets at once. It's important to clarify though that Red Hat charges a subscription for their services like certifications, industry grade support, security patches, etc., not the software products themselves. However, the pre-compiled binaries that ship with their OS also comes with the subscription, and, at least from the research I've done, are simply sold to companies as a convenience and are not a product of proprietary code. These pre-compiled binaries serve simply to provide their customers with an officially supported, certified, maintained and ready-to-go bundle of software, saving the business themselves from handling software bugs or glitches or compiling software from source, with the source code being made available to us consumers as well as those non-Red Hat customers, which used to be done through the Git repository, but in 2023 Red Hat stopped supplying the code to the repositories, so now it seems the only way to gain access to the source code is through the so-called CentOS stream. Oh, the beloved CentOS. That may be a familiar name to you, just in case you're a little confused like I was. Even though CentOS 8 was discontinued a few years ago, the project has been rebranded into the CentOS stream, which acts as an upstream version to Red Hat Enterprise Linux as opposed to the downstream stable version that the OG CentOS was. In other words, Red Hat rug pulled everyone on CentOS who thought they had 10 years of guaranteed updates and free Red Hat software compatibility and replaced the stable, server admin loved proven code running distro that was CentOS with CentOS Stream. This made the user base of CentOS Stream little more than guinea pigs Red Hat could use to trial their software on a large user base before shipping it to their Enterprise Edition, giving Red Hat a little non-financial kickback that they weren't getting with the OG CentOS. Now, at the time, CentOS was quite popular, so when Red Hat, a company owned by IBM, decided to go back on their 10-year promise of continued support and essentially just cut them off, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. One of these people was actually the co-founder of CentOS, Gregory Kurtzer. You might not have heard of him, I definitely hadn't, but you might have heard of the Linux distro he started after CentOS was discontinued, and that is Rocky Linux. And whilst Rocky Linux is entirely community developed and supported, with it aiming to fulfill the gap left by the discontinuation of CentOS, A video on Rocky Linux can wait for another time. Before this video, I didn't know too much about Red Hat, and now I see why some people are pretty upset with how they are skirting around the licensing requirements for their software to be free and open source, because whilst it technically is today, it's not that easy to get your hands on it. Alright, I've been yapping about Red Hat for a little while now, so in an effort to make this video not entirely based on Red Hat, we got to talk about Ubuntu. Whilst Ubuntu is one of the largest consumer Linux distributions, it is also owned by Canonical, a private company based in the UK with annual revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Of course, this money has to come from somewhere, and whilst Ubuntu isn't the only product that Canonical manages, it certainly has the largest reach. Ubuntu itself is, of course, free and open source. However, for businesses at least, Ubuntu Pro requires cash money. Now, Ubuntu Pro, excluding the individual license where Ubuntu Pro is free, is a paid version of Ubuntu that features extended security patches, human support, and other stuff that enterprises and businesses look for. This is again an enterprise-oriented version of a consumer operating system. This seems to work pretty well for Canonical, who can provide free and open source software to the average consumer, whilst also sticking a few certification stickers on it and providing extended support with a price tag to large organizations and businesses that need a stable, Unix-based operating system for anything from cloud hosting to running those interactive advertisement boards you see in shopping centres and the like. The fact that the Pro version is free for individual users and not for businesses is itself a business decision. If you can get a bunch of consumers using Ubuntu, some of them are bound to replace their business systems with it, or at least convince their managers to do so. It works out in Ubuntu's favour pretty well, and seemingly, it's paid off very handsomely for them. However, Ubuntu is not without a few past issues. For example, in 2012, Richard Stallman, the man himself, called out Ubuntu for its inclusion of Amazon services within the default install of Ubuntu. That not only provided a shortcut to the Amazon store, but also recorded the search terms the user entered into the Unity search bar, Unity being Ubuntu's custom desktop environment, and would then use that information to generate targeted advertising to the user based on those searches. This didn't sit very well with people once they realised, of course, and Canonical soon removed the feature from newer versions of Ubuntu. Canonical also owns and operates the distribution of Snap packages. Snaps, according to Canonical, are pieces of self-contained software that interact minimally with the host system. However, the storefront from which they are distributed from and the backend is proprietary software. And since there is no other official way to download these snaps, you are forced into using a system whose code is behind closed doors, going against the Linux ethos. So snaps can sometimes be pretty useful when downloading software. I personally only use snaps if the software I'm downloading is itself proprietary, so any benefit I would have of keeping my system as open source as possible is lost anyway. And finally, SUSE. Founded in Germany, it has perambulated its way into being one of the most established enterprise Linux distributions around today, and whilst the organisation behind the development of OpenSUSE has changed a fair few times, along with their priorities, it has stuck around in both enterprise and consumer circles. In response to Red Hat cutting support for CentOS and restricting access to their source code as much as they could get away with anyway, SUSE committed a reported $10 million to forking the entire Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system to keep it as open as possible to the consumer. They also helped found the Open Enterprise Linux Association, along with Oracle and Rocky Linux. OpenSUSE and the two main versions that SUSE the organisation manages are distros that I've seldom seen used as regular desktop Linux distros. However, for those who do use one of them, they seem to like it. And if you've ever used Leap or Tumbleweed at some point as your daily driver, please let me know how good or bad it was. I know it's pretty common knowledge, within tech at least, that these distros are corporate products. I just really wanted an excuse to conduct a rabbit hole research task by myself and have something to show for it at the end. I hope you learned something interesting about either of them or the subsequent products that spawned from them at the very least. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, like the video and comment. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.